Okay, everybody, let's talk about Jurassic Park. Specifically, I want to talk about the prospect of bringing dinosaurs back to life. We've all seen Jurassic Park, or at least most of us have, and in that movie, they brought back the dinosaurs through genetic engineering. They took DNA from mosquitoes that had fed on dinosaurs, and they used that to fill in the gaps in dinosaur DNA and then clone the dinosaurs. This is an interesting idea, but is it possible? Well, we're going to talk about that today. So let's start out with what we do know about dinosaurs. Dinosaurs went extinct about 66 million years ago. There are two main pieces of evidence for this. One is the KPG event, or the Cretaceous-Paleogene event. This is a thin layer of sediment found all over the world that contains an abnormally high amount of the element iridium. Iridium is rare on the Earth's surface, but it's relatively common in asteroids. So scientists think that this iridium came from an asteroid that hit the Earth, and that asteroid is thought to be the one that killed off the dinosaurs. The other line of evidence comes from the fossil record itself. There is a gap between the latest Cretaceous rocks and the earliest Paleogene rocks, so there are no fossils of any animals that lived after the asteroid impact and before the first Paleogene rocks were deposited. That gap is 3 million years long. So based on these two lines of evidence, we know that the dinosaurs went extinct around 66 million years ago. But just how dead are they? Well, to answer that question, we need to take a look at DNA. DNA degrades very quickly. Under ideal conditions, DNA will degrade in around 600,000 years. However, in most cases, DNA degradation is much more rapid. It's rare to find DNA that is older than 1 million years. And that's because not only does the DNA itself degrade, but also the molecule that carries the DNA, which is usually bone, also degrades. The problem is that the chemical processes that break down bone are orders of magnitude faster than the rate of DNA degradation. So if you find fossilized bone, chances are that the DNA has already been degraded into a soup of amino acids. And that's the case for dinosaur fossils, all of them. Dinosaur bones have been weathered, eroded, leached, fractured, replaced, disintegrated, and decayed. In other words, the DNA has been degraded. However, in certain rare circumstances, we can find soft tissue in fossils. For example, in 2007, paleontologists found a fossil of a duck-billed dinosaur in Canada. It was remarkable because it contained cells and even some complete cell membranes. Now, this was surprising because it was expected that all of the organic material would have degraded long ago. But there it was right in the fossil itself. But it turns out that while some of the cellular structures remained intact, the DNA itself was still degraded. So while there is some organic material preserved in fossils, it's unlikely that you'll find intact DNA. And that's exactly what we don't have for dinosaurs. No intact DNA. But wait, didn't they find dinosaur DNA in a mosquito in amber in Jurassic Park? Well, not really. You see, in Jurassic Park, they used DNA from a mosquito that was preserved in amber. Amber is tree resin that hardens over time. And when it hardens, it can trap things like insects inside. So it's actually pretty easy to find insects trapped in amber. But finding one that still has good enough DNA to sequence is extraordinarily rare. Even though many amber samples contain insects, very few of those insects have any DNA left at all. And of the ones that do, almost none of it is good enough to sequence. There have only been a handful of insects whose DNA could be extracted and sequenced, and most of those insects are only partially sequenced. One of the better examples is a bee from the Dominican Republic. Researchers were able to get a few sequences from this bee, and they showed that it was very closely related to modern bees. But the point is that getting usable DNA out of an insect in amber is extremely unlikely. And that brings us to the most recent news about extracting DNA from insects in amber. In 2023, researchers tried their hand at extracting DNA from a beetle that was encased in amber from the Dominican Republic. The beetle is called a scarab beetle, and it's a relative of the modern-day scarab beetle. The thing is that this beetle lived about 15 to 20 million years ago, which is fairly recent on the geological time scale. The researchers were able to extract some fragments of DNA, but there wasn't very much and it was highly degraded. They got about 5,000 DNA fragments, and they ranged in length from 50 to 800 base pairs. But there was a huge problem. The researchers couldn't confirm that the DNA was from the beetle. Maybe it was from bacteria or fungi or something else. So it was impossible to tell if this was actual arthropod DNA or not. But the researchers did say that given enough time, we might be able to extract DNA from dinosaurs. Now, if they mean by that like in our lifetime, I wouldn't bet on it. But theoretically, maybe. But even if we did somehow get dino DNA, how difficult would it be to bring them back to life? Well, cloning Dolly the sheep was a huge scientific achievement. At the time, it was considered one of the greatest scientific achievements in history, and yet Dolly was only about 5% different from her parent. By contrast, humans are about 15% different from chimps and about 80% different from fruit flies. So cloning an animal that is very similar to a living animal is a lot easier than cloning an animal that is very different. So cloning a dinosaur would be much more difficult than cloning Dolly. And we don't know if it would even be possible. But assuming that we could clone a dinosaur, would it even be ethical? Many people argue that it would be unethical. Some say that we shouldn't mess with nature or play God. Others say that they would like to see them brought back to life. And others say that we should only bring them back if we could ensure that they live a good life. And of course, we don't know how to do any of that. So ultimately, it's impossible to say what the right thing to do would be. But here's the thing. Even if we could clone a dinosaur, we wouldn't want to. The reason is that dinosaurs would probably cause a mass extinction. If you doubt me, just watch Jurassic World. Just imagine a megalodon swimming through the coral reefs, killing everything in its path. Or a T-Rex hunting down sauropods and triceratops. An ecosystem is a very delicate balance of competing species. If you introduce a new species into an ecosystem, it can throw the whole thing out of whack. And that's why invasive species are so dangerous. And that's why we try so hard to keep non-native species out of places like Florida and Hawaii. So even if we could clone a dinosaur, we definitely shouldn't. But what if we cloned a dinosaur and then put it in a zoo or something? Well, there are two problems with that. One is that even if you built the biggest enclosure imaginable, it still wouldn't be able to replicate a dinosaur's natural habitat. Think about how much space a T-Rex needed to roam. It would need hundreds, if not thousands, of square kilometers. A zoo just can't accommodate that. The other problem is that dinosaurs evolved over tens of millions of years. They adapted to a changing climate, changing vegetation, and changing ecosystems. But since we only have a single generation of dinosaurs, we would essentially be putting them in an unnatural environment. Basically, they would be a completely exotic species in an ecosystem where nothing has evolved to deal with them. So even if we put dinosaurs in a perfect artificial habitat, they wouldn't thrive. In conclusion, cloning a dinosaur is very unlikely to ever happen. But in theory, if we could clone a dinosaur, it would still be very difficult to bring it back to life, and it would probably be unethical anyway. And that's why we'll never see a Jurassic Park in real life. At least that's my opinion. But what do you think? Do you think that we'll ever bring dinosaurs back to life? Let me know in the comments below. Also, thank you for watching and supporting this channel. I'll see you next time.